There was a woman who came to see me once. She smiled the entire hour. She smiled when she spoke of her mother who had wounded her. She smiled when she spoke of her husband who had forgotten her birthday for the third year in a row. She smiled when she told me she wanted to die. And I remember sitting across from her, watching that smile and thinking, this is not a woman who is at peace. This is a woman who has been at war with herself for so long that she has mistaken the silence of surrender for the silence of calm. Somewhere, decades before, a small girl had learned that her anger was dangerous, not dangerous to others, dangerous to love itself. And so she buried it. She buried it so well that she forgot where the grave was. And what grew instead over that unmarked grave was a smile that never reached her eyes. I want to tell you something tonight that may unsettle you before it heals you. Your anger is not the enemy of your goodness. It never was. Somewhere along the road of your life, someone taught you that to be good was to be quiet, that to be loved was to be agreeable, that to be safe was to disappear into what others needed from you. And you believed it because you were young and because the alternative, abandonment, felt like death to a child's nervous system. So you built a mask, a very good mask, a mask so convincing that you yourself forgot it was a mask. And behind that mask, something sacred has been waiting, waiting through every meal you did not want to eat but ate anyway, waiting through every apology you did not owe but gave anyway, waiting through every version of yourself you erased just to keep the peace. Tonight, I am not here to teach you how to be more pleasant. I am here to introduce you to what you buried alive. Let me speak plainly, because the hour is short and the soul does not have patience for decoration. There is a particular kind of person in this world, you may be one of them, who feels what others feel before they have even spoken it, who walks into a room and knows, without being told, that someone is grieving, someone is furious, someone is frightened. This capacity is not a curse, though it has often been treated as one. It is a form of perception so refined that it borders on the mystical. But perception without boundary becomes possession. And so the empath, the feeler, the one who senses everything, so often becomes the one who disappears into everyone. Their own anger, the one emotion that says, this far and no further, becomes the first casualty. Because to feel your own anger while also feeling everyone else's pain is unbearable. So you drop yours, you let it go. You tell yourself you are being generous, but you are not being generous. You are going missing. I have spent my life studying what lies beneath the visible personality, the vast, dark, teeming underworld of the psyche that the daylight mind prefers not to look at. And of all the things I have found down there, none is more misunderstood than anger. We have been taught, especially those of us who are tender, who are sensitive, who feel the suffering of the world as though it were our own, that anger is the opposite of love, that the spiritual path, the good path, the enlightened path is a path without fire. This is a lie, and it is a lie that has hollowed out more gentle souls than any cruelty ever could. Anger is not the opposite of love. Indifference is the opposite of love. Anger, rightly understood, is love's bodyguard. It is the force that rises when something we cherish, our dignity, our boundaries, our children, our truth, is under threat. To have no anger at all is not enlightenment. It is often just exhaustion, wearing a peaceful face. Consider the mask. I have called it the persona, borrowing the word from the ancient theater, where actors wore carved faces to announce to the audience which role they were playing. The persona is not false, exactly. It is a necessary garment, a way of meeting the world without exposing every raw nerve to every stranger. We all need one. The danger is not in wearing it. The danger is in forgetting that we are wearing it. The danger is in becoming so identified with the pleasant, accommodating, endlessly understanding face we show the world that we lose the address of our own interior house. I have seen brilliant men and women, kind, generous, perceptive people who could tell you everything about the emotional weather of everyone around them, and nothing at all about their own. They had become so skilled at reading others that they had gone illiterate in the language of themselves. And beneath the persona, in the cellar of the personality, is what I have called the shadow. The shadow is everything we could not afford to be and remain loved. For the empath, for the pleaser, for the one raised to believe that their worth was measured by how little trouble they caused, the shadow is very often crowded with anger, not petty irritation, real anger. The anger of a self that was asked again and again to shrink so that others could remain comfortable. This anger does not vanish simply because it is not permitted daylight. It goes underground, and what goes underground does not die. It ferments, it waits, and eventually it finds a way out through the body, through illness, through a depression that has no obvious cause, through a rage that erupts sideways at the wrong moment, over, over something small, because the real target was never allowed to be named. I want you to understand something about the structure of the psyche, because it will change the way you see your own suffering. What we refuse to face in ourselves, we are condemned to meet in the world outside us. This is not superstition. It is the plainest psychological law I know. The energy of the unacknowledged anger does not simply evaporate. It is projected. It appears disguised in the people who seem to provoke us endlessly, in the situations that keep repeating no matter how many times we change the cast of characters. The colleague who always takes advantage, the partner who always forgets, the friend who always calls only when they need something. You may believe you keep encountering difficult people by bad luck. I would ask you to consider a harder truth. You may be broadcasting, without a single word, that you are available to be used. And the world, which is not cruel so much as it is simply responsive, answers the signal you are sending. This is not your fault. I want to be very clear about that, because guilt is not the medicine I am offering tonight. You did not choose as a child to learn that your needs were negotiable. Someone taught you that. A parent overwhelmed by their own unmet longing. A household where love was conditional on your compliance. A culture, and this is true across nearly every culture I have studied, East and West alike, that has told the sensitive ones, and especially the sensitive women, that their highest calling is to soften themselves into whatever shape makes others comfortable. You adapted brilliantly. You survived. The pleasing was not weakness. It was intelligence deployed in service of staying loved in a world where love once felt conditional. But the strategy that saved the child is now suffocating the adult. What was once protection has become a prison, and the walls of that prison are built from your own perpetual. Yes, let me tell you what happens to a person who spends 30, 40, 50 years saying yes when the whole of their being is screaming no. The body remembers what the mouth denies. I have watched it in consulting rooms more times than I can count. The migraine that appears every time a boundary should have been spoken and was not. The exhaustion that no amount of sleep repairs, because it is not the body that is tired, it is the self that has been abandoned. The autoimmune conditions, the digestive troubles, the chronic tension in the jaw and the shoulders and the low back, all of it the physical residue of a lifetime of swallowed fire. The body is not stupid. The body has been keeping score the whole time. Even while the mind insisted that everything was fine, that this was simply what a good person, a loving person, a spiritual person does. The body knows the difference between generosity and self-erasure, even when the mind has forgotten how to tell them apart. I want to speak now about what anger actually is, stripped of the moral costume we have dressed it in. Anger, at its root, is information. It is the psyche's oldest and most reliable signal that a boundary has been crossed, that a value has been violated, that something sacred is being treated as disposable. A child does not need to be taught anger. Watch any infant whose need goes unmet. The anger arrives instantly, uncomplicated, unashamed. It is only later, through the long education of pleasing, that we learn to be ashamed of this signal, to apologize for it, to swallow it whole, and call the swallowing maturity. But the animal wisdom in the anger was never wrong. It was only ever inconvenient. For the empath in particular, anger carries an additional and more sacred function, because you feel the emotional states of others so vividly, so immediately. The boundary between what belongs to you and what belongs to another can blur until it disappears entirely. Anger, in this context, is not a threat to your compassion. It is the very thing that makes compassion sustainable. It is the wall that allows the garden to exist. Without it, you do not become more loving. You become a corridor through which everyone else's pain passes unfiltered until you are so full of other people's storms that you cannot locate your own weather anymore. The empath who has reclaimed her anger does not become harder. She becomes able to love without disappearing while she does it. I have used the word sacred deliberately tonight, and I do not use it lightly. The sacred, in my understanding, is not confined to temples and scripture. The sacred is whatever connects us most directly to the wholeness of our own being, and by that measure, anger, clean anger, honest anger, anger that says, I matter, this matters, that is enough, is one of the most sacred forces available to the human soul. It is not sacred because it is comfortable. Very little that is sacred is comfortable. It is sacred because it is true. It is the part of you that has never once agreed to your own erasure, no matter how long you kept it locked in the basement. It has been waiting down there this whole time, not to destroy you, but to return you to yourself. Now, I must be careful here, because there is a great difference between anger as a messenger and anger as a master. I am not standing before you tonight to tell you to become cruel, to lash out, to mistake volume for truth, or aggression for authenticity. That is not integration. That is simply the shadow seizing the wheel instead of remaining locked in the trunk. And a car driven from the trunk crashes just as surely as one abandoned entirely. What I am describing is something far more demanding and far more mature than either suppression or explosion. I am describing the slow, patient work of listening to your anger the way you would listen to a frightened animal, without flinching from it and without letting it maul the furniture either. You do not need to become someone who yells. You need to become someone who no longer needs to swallow. This is the difference between pleasing and presence, and I want to dwell on it because it is the whole of what I have come to say tonight. Pleasing is a performance for an audience. It asks constantly and anxiously, what do they need from me right now, and how quickly can I become it? It is exhausting because it requires you to monitor everyone in the room except yourself. Presence asks a different question entirely. Presence asks, what is true right now, and can I stay here with it without abandoning myself or the other person? Presence does not require you to become cold or withholding. It requires you to become whole enough that your warmth is no longer a transaction. The pleaser gives from fear, fear of being unloved, unwanted, too much, not enough. The present person gives from fullness, and only one of those forms of giving can be sustained across a lifetime without destroying the giver. I think of the persona and the shadow as two halves of a single coin that has been split apart and hidden in different rooms of the same house. The persona lives upstairs, in the parlor, greeting guests, offering tea, apologizing for the weather. The shadow lives in the cellar, in the dark, holding everything the parlor was too frightened to say. The work of becoming a whole person, what I have called individuation, is not the work of destroying the parlor or burning down the house. It is the work of building a staircase. It is the slow, unglamorous labor of walking down into the cellar again and again, not to live there, but to retrieve what belongs to you and carry it back upstairs into the light where it can finally be integrated instead of imprisoned. And here is the great secret that so few are told. The anger you have been suppressing your entire life is not waiting down there to punish you for your years of silence. It is waiting to thank you for finally coming to get it. It has never wanted to hurt you. It has only ever wanted to protect you, and it has been trying to do its job from exile, banished to the cellar, shouting up through the floorboards in the only language available to it. Your fatigue, your resentment, your inexplicable tears at 3 in the morning, your sudden coldness toward people you cannot explain, your body's quiet rebellions. Every one of those has been a letter sent up from the cellar, and every one of those letters has said the same thing. I am still here. I never left. I am waiting for you to let me help. I want to address the particular terror that arises when a lifelong pleaser first begins to feel their own anger clearly. It is not a gentle sensation. It often arrives less like a candle and more like a furnace, because it has been building pressure for years, sometimes for decades, and the first honest contact with it can feel less like liberation and more like danger. You may fear, in that moment, that you are becoming someone unrecognizable, someone unkind, someone your loved ones will no longer want. I want to offer you a different way of understanding that fear. What is actually happening is not that you are becoming a worse person. It is that you are meeting, for the first time in a very long while, the part of yourself that was never permitted to exist in the open. Of course it feels enormous. It has been compressed under decades of smiling agreement. Let it be enormous. It will not stay enormous forever. Anger that is finally witnessed, finally allowed, tends to move through the body like weather, intense, then passing, then gone, leaving behind a clarity that no amount of pleasing ever produced. What tends to remain, once the initial storm has passed, is not rage. It is discernment. It is the capacity, at last, to know what you want without apologizing for wanting it. It is the ability to say no without a 3-paragraph explanation defending your right to say it. It is the strange, almost frightening relief of realizing that you can disappoint someone and still be a good person. This is not a small realization. For the lifelong pleaser, it is nothing less than a second birth. The first birth brought you into the world as a body. This second birth brings you into the world as a self with edges, with preferences, with a will that does not need to be constantly justified in order to exist. I would like to speak now about the mothers and fathers, the mentors and elders who taught so many of you that your anger was unacceptable, because understanding them is part of releasing yourself. In nearly every case I have encountered, those who punished a child's anger were themselves people whose own anger had never been permitted a home. They were not monsters. They were, more often than not, exhausted, overwhelmed, carrying grief and rage of their own that no one had ever taught them to hold. A parent who cannot tolerate their own anger will almost always find their child's anger intolerable, because the child's fire is a mirror held up to the parent's own extinguished flame. This does not excuse the wound, but it does explain it, and understanding can loosen the grip of resentment in a way that mere forgiveness sometimes cannot. You inherited a fear of fire from people who were themselves taught to fear it. Somewhere this pattern must end. It might as well end with you. Let me tell you what presence actually looks like in the ordinary texture of a life, because I do not want to leave you with only philosophy when what you need is practice. Presence looks like sitting in a meeting where you disagree and saying so plainly without softening it into oblivion first. Presence looks like telling a friend that their behavior hurt you without immediately following it with three reassurances that you are not really upset. Presence looks like leaving a conversation that has become one-sided, not because you no longer love the person, but because you have finally understood that loving them does not require abandoning yourself. Presence looks like silence that is chosen rather than silence that is enforced by fear. Presence looks like a face that is allowed to show what is actually happening inside it, rather than a face perpetually arranged into reassurance for the comfort of everyone else in the room. I want to say something about the fear of being disliked, because it sits at the very root of the pleasing pattern, and it deserves to be looked at directly rather than around. Somewhere in you is a belief planted long ago that being disliked is equivalent to being unsafe. For a child, this may even have been true. A child's survival genuinely does depend on the goodwill of the adults around them. But you are no longer a child, and the belief that once protected you now costs you your whole life, coin by coin, every time you silence a true thought to preserve someone else's comfort. I would ask you to consider a radical possibility that being disliked by the wrong people is not a catastrophe, but a form of information, telling you clearly who was never able to hold the whole of you in the first place. The people who can only love your compliance were never loving you. They were loving your usefulness. And there is a profound, if painful, freedom in finally being able to tell the difference. There is an old alchemical image I have returned to many times in my work. The notion that the base, unworthy material, the thing the alchemists called the prima materia, is not separate from the gold they sought to create. It is the very substance from which the gold is made. Nothing needs to be imported from outside. Everything necessary for the transformation is already present in the raw, unrefined, seemingly worthless material at hand. I offer this image to you tonight because I believe your anger is exactly this, not an impurity to be burned away on your path toward becoming a better, gentler, more spiritual person, but the very substance from which your wholeness will be forged. You do not need to import peace from somewhere outside yourself. You need to transform what you already possess. The anger is not the obstacle to your becoming. The anger is the ore. I think often about the difference between a fire that is allowed to burn in a hearth and a fire that has been shut inside a wall. The fire in the hearth warms a house. It cooks food. It gathers people around it in the evening. It is dangerous only if you ignore it entirely or feed it recklessly. And both of those failures are failures of relationship, not failures of the fire itself. But a fire shut inside a wall, unseen, untended, does not go out simply because no one acknowledges it. It smolders, it spreads along hidden channels, and eventually, if it is never addressed, it brings the whole house down, often at the moment when everyone believed the house was safest. Your anger, hidden for years inside the walls of your pleasing, has been smoldering this whole time. The work before you now is not to extinguish it. It is to build it a hearth. I want to speak directly to the exhaustion so many of you carry, because I suspect some of you sitting here tonight are more tired than you have admitted to anyone, perhaps more tired than you have admitted to yourselves. This is the particular fatigue of the perpetual pleaser, not merely physical tiredness, but the deeper exhaustion of having maintained a performance for so long that you have lost track of where the performance ends and you begin. I want you to know that this exhaustion is not a personal failing. It is not evidence that you are weak or insufficiently grateful for your blessings. It is the entirely predictable result of asking a single human nervous system to carry the emotional weight of everyone around it, while denying its own weight the right to be carried by anyone at all. You were never meant to hold that much. No one was. The path forward is not a single dramatic confrontation, though such moments may come, and when they come, you need not fear them. The path forward is 1,000 small honesties, practiced daily, until they become as natural as the pleasing once was. It is the small no, spoken plainly, without justification. It is the honest sentence, offered before resentment has had time to build a case against the other person in the silent courtroom of your mind. It is the willingness to let a moment be awkward rather than perform your way out of every discomfort in the room. None of this requires cruelty. All of it requires courage, because the nervous system that learned pleasing as survival will resist these small honesties at first, will flood you with warnings, will tell you that this time, finally, the disaster will come. It will feel, for a while, like walking a plank blindfolded. I promise you there is solid ground beneath it. I want to offer you a way of relating to your own anger that may be unfamiliar, because most of what you have been taught about anger positions you as either its victim or its enforcer. Either you are overwhelmed by it, or you must control it through sheer will. There is a third position, older and wiser than either. You can become the anger's witness. You can learn to feel the heat rise in your chest, the tightness in your jaw, the sudden clarity in your thinking, and rather than either drowning in it or slamming a lid over it, you can simply say, inwardly, I see you. I hear what you are telling me. Let me understand what boundary has been crossed before I decide what to do about it. This single shift from being possessed by the anger or terrified of it to witnessing it as a messenger with something specific to say is very often the difference between a lifetime of eruption or suppression and the beginning of genuine mastery. You will find, if you practice this witnessing faithfully, that your anger becomes remarkably precise. It does not, in truth, want to destroy your relationships. It wants to clarify them. It does not want you to become someone who cannot be reasoned with. It wants you to become someone who cannot be overridden. There is an enormous difference between the two, and it is precisely the difference between the wound and the medicine. A person who cannot be reasoned with has lost access to their own reflection and simply reacts. A person who cannot be overridden has full access to their reflection and simply refuses calmly to abandon what they know to be true. This is not the loud, chaotic anger you may fear becoming. This is anger matured into conviction, and conviction, once it settles into a person, tends to look remarkably like peace from the outside, even though it is built from fire. I have watched people undergo this transformation, and I want to tell you what becomes possible on the other side of it, because I think you deserve to know what you are working toward, not only what you are working through. On the other side of reclaimed anger is a capacity for genuine intimacy that pleasing can never produce, because pleasing, however well intentioned, is always a barrier disguised as a bridge. It offers connection to a version of you that does not fully exist. Presence offers connection to the version of you that does. People who meet the present version of you may occasionally be surprised, even briefly unsettled, because they are encountering someone with actual contours for the first time. But the relationships that survive this transition become immeasurably more real, and the ones that do not survive it were very often relationships that depended on your disappearance to function at all. Losing those is not a tragedy. It is a correction. I would ask you tonight to consider the particular gift that your sensitivity has always been, apart from the wound of having to defend it. The capacity to feel deeply, to sense the undercurrents in a room, to know another person's pain before they have spoken a word of it. This is not a burden to be endured. It is, when it is finally paired with boundary rather than boundlessness, one of the rarest and most valuable forms of perception a human being can possess. The world does not need you to become less sensitive. The world needs your sensitivity married to your fire, because a feeler without boundaries becomes exhausted and eventually resentful, but a feeler who has reclaimed her anger becomes something closer to what I would call a healer, someone who can be fully present with another's suffering without being destroyed by it, because she has learned at last where she ends and the other person begins. There is a particular moment I want to describe to you, because many of you will recognize it, and those who have not yet reached it will recognize it when it arrives. It is the moment when you say no to someone you love, clearly, without an accompanying essay of justification, and instead of the sky falling, the person simply says, okay, and you stand there afterward in a kind of stunned silence because some ancient part of you had fully expected catastrophe and none arrived. This moment, small as it may sound, is one of the great turning points of a human life. It is the moment the nervous system finally receives evidence, direct and undeniable, that the old belief was a lie, that you can be your true self and still be safe, that you can disappoint and still be loved. That presence, not pleasing, was always the thing that made you worth loving in the first place. I want to close, as the hour grows late, with something that resembles less a conclusion and more an invitation, because I do not believe this work concludes. It is not a task to be completed and filed away. It is a relationship to be tended for the rest of your life, the way a garden is tended, the way a fire in a hearth is tended, not once, but continually, with attention, with patience, with the humility to know that old patterns will occasionally reassert themselves, and that this is not failure. It is simply the ongoing nature of becoming whole. You will slip back into pleasing sometimes. You will swallow something you should have spoken. And when this happens, I want you to resist the temptation to punish yourself for it, because self-punishment is simply pleasing turned inward. It is the same old strategy of appeasement, now aimed at an internal judge instead of an external audience. Instead, simply notice, simply return. The staircase to the cellar is always there. You need only remember it exists. What I am asking of you is not to become a harder person. It is to become a more honest one. What I am asking of you is not to abandon your compassion, which I suspect is one of the great treasures of your character, but to place that compassion on a foundation strong enough to hold it. And that foundation is your own reclaimed anger, your own willingness to say, this matters, and so do I. The empath who integrates her anger does not become less loving. She becomes loving in a form that can actually be sustained because it no longer costs her everything to give it. She gives from abundance instead of from depletion. And this changes not only her life, but the lives of everyone who receives her presence instead of her performance. I want you to leave here tonight and notice over the coming days every small moment in which you feel the old pull to smooth things over, to make yourself smaller, to swallow a truth, to keep the peace. I do not ask you to fix every one of these moments immediately. I ask you only to notice them, because noticing is the beginning of everything. Awareness is the first and most necessary act of reclamation. You cannot integrate what you refuse to see, and you have spent a very long time refusing to see this particular fire inside you, out of love for people who, however unintentionally, taught you that the fire was dangerous. It was never dangerous. It was only ever unwelcome in rooms too small to hold the whole of who you are. You are not required to remain in those rooms. You are not required to keep shrinking to fit doorways built for a smaller version of yourself, a version constructed in childhood, out of necessity, and worn now out of habit alone. The sacred anger you have carried since you were small has never once betrayed you. It has waited patiently, faithfully, in the cellar of your own being, for the day you would finally come down the stairs, open the door, and say, I am ready now. I am ready to stop performing peace and start living it. I am ready to trade the mask for the face beneath it, however unfamiliar that face may feel at first. That day does not need to be a distant one. It can begin the moment you leave this room. It can begin with the very next conversation in which you feel the old pull to disappear, and choose instead, quietly and without spectacle, to remain. This is the work, not the eradication of your gentleness, but its marriage to your fire. Not the silencing of your anger, but its transformation from a hidden wound into a sacred guardian. Not the abandonment of the pleasing self, who did, after all, keep you alive through years you did not choose, but the gentle, grateful retirement of her, so that a fuller self, a truer self, a self capable of presence rather than performance, can finally step forward and live the life that was always, from the very beginning, waiting for you. Go and be that fire, tended rather than hidden. Go and be that presence, chosen rather than performed. The world does not need another perfectly pleasant absence in the room. It needs you, the whole of you, anger and tenderness both, finally standing in the same body, finally speaking with the same voice. That is not a loss of your goodness. That is the beginning of it.